Hi all, this is Mr. Yeager looking at reaction rate for chemistry. All right. This is going to look kind of similar, I feel like, to equilibrium. You'll see a lot of factors that will affect rate are ones that we talked about in equilibrium. But instead of trying to figure out which way the reaction is going to go, we are looking at how fast the reaction is going and why does that occur and obviously some other factors that come into play. Okay. So what we're really hammering is what is the reaction rate and how can we affect the reaction rate. Those are the two things I'm asking you to figure out. So what is rate? So obviously if I talk about a car and I say, well, how do we measure the rate of a car is traveling? What am I referring to there? Well, I'm talking about speed. I'm talking about how fast something is happening, how far it goes in a particular amount of time. So instead of looking at it from obviously a speed perspective of how far you're going, what can we measure about the rate of reaction? Well, that's all about basically the idea of how things are changing from one to the other. So how quickly do I change my reactants into products? And in particular, relate that to concentration again. And ultimately, again, you can see where we keep on hammering this idea of concentration. That's all related to the moles involved and how quickly we're changing from one type of substance into another. So we're going to measure how quickly that occurs, all right? Or that would be how reaction rate is measured. Ultimately, though, we're more interested in, again, there we go. So again, reaction rate is the change in concentration of a reactant or product per unit of time. Again, one good point to kind of slow down and see this here is the idea that we can either see the change in reactants occurring or the change in products, because obviously they go hand in hand. So what's going to affect rates? Okay. So first off, we need to go, okay, well, how do I know, like, why will a chemical reaction occur? All right. And so there's basically two things that we look at here. First, in order for a chemical reaction to occur, those chemicals actually have to collide with each other. If they're not touching each other, there's not going to be any sort of interaction in between them. So they have to collide, and it turns out they actually have to collide in a correct orientation. All right. What I mean is it's not just them going slam into each other. It's they have to actually orient themselves based on their shapes. Okay. And if they're trying to reach, we talked about, even if just talking about H2O, are we going to run into the oxygen, and is that what we're reacting with, or are we going to run into the hydrogen? It depends on the type of chemical involved of which side we're really trying to hammer into. Okay, but this also gets into larger molecules as well when we're talking about proteins and amino acids and all sorts of things, and especially in biology, really depends on orienting and opening up some of those large molecules so that we can get to certain parts of it that want to react or will react. So that's where the collision comes into play. Second, it has to meet a certain activation energy. All right. And what is activation energy? I'm going to skip to the bottom. Activation energy is the minimum energy required to begin a chemical reaction. All right. So this is where just because they collide into each other doesn't mean a chemical reaction is going to occur. Even if they collide with the correct orientation, there has to be enough energy to cause a break or energy that can then be pulled in to form that chemical bond. Okay? And so that's the activation energy. This whole thing is essentially called kinetic molecular theory. All right? And it's the idea that, if I go into more detail with it, that molecules are generally independent of each other if they're in the gaseous state. There's mostly space in between them. They need to collide in the correct orientation, and they need to have enough activation energy to have a reaction occur. Okay? So this is an activation energy graph. This is very important to kind of point out and see what's happening here. Okay? So these are always written, as you can see, where reactants are going to be on the left, products are on the right. And we will always see this basic kind of curve structure, all right? Now, the result will not always be exactly the same. It'll be this curve structure, but those products could be above or below, or even possibly at the same energy as the reactants. They're almost always above or below, all right? But a couple important things to point out about this particular graph. The idea is, as I move left to right, we're calling that a reaction coordinate, that's showing you the progress of reaction. Are we on the reactant side or are we on the product side, okay? And so if we're on the reactant side, the idea is we have all of these particles, and they can be slamming in, colliding into each other. But when they do, they have to reach a certain level of energy. And so the energy from where the reactants essentially initially start at equilibrium, I would basically say, to this point at the top of the curve, that is officially the activation energy. So from where the reactants start to the top of the curve, they need to have this much energy. So if reactants come in right here and they collide with each other, they're going to still slide back down the hill and stay reactants. But if they come in with enough energy and they reach that activation energy amount, they can now slide to the other side and become products. All right, it's almost like the idea of like skiing up and down a hill. If you want to get all the way up that hill and ski down the other side, you have to put that much energy in. Clearly, if I'm above that amount of energy based on temperature, okay, temperature might help obviously improve the activation energy, giving the particles enough energy to do it. We can have them be way over that, and then they can slide down and become much, much less. But, so that is, again, interpreting a graph. One other thing you can see here, we talked about Gibbs free energy. The difference between where the reactants start and where the products are is the Gibbs free energy of that reaction. You can see this one is negative, all right, saying that this reaction is favorable for the products. Okay, this is favorable for us to go ahead and proceed and create products. We are going to a lower energy. This is also sometimes measured just by enthalpy. So you can actually measure the enthalpy change between the reactants and products if I give you that. If I say the enthalpy of the reactants is 400 and the enthalpy of the products is 200, the change in enthalpy is negative 200 kilojoules or joules or whatever it is. Okay, so that's another part of it. A third thing we can do with this energy, activation energy chart is you can tell me whether the reaction is exo or endothermic. If the products is less than the reactants in terms of the energy, and again, this side is essentially energy. I hope we understood that since everything else is saying the change in energy occurring. This is going to be an exothermic reaction. What I could possibly see is I could see a reaction where it goes up and maybe stops right here, where the products are above the reactants. If that's the case, if products is greater than the reactants, then we have an endothermic reaction. Again, energy must have been absorbed, okay, for that to occur. So that is everything we can get out of an activation energy chart. So what are things that we can maybe help encourage these reactions, again, to go faster and faster and faster? Oh, I guess so. Sorry, I'll point out one other thing. Clearly, when the activation energy is lower, when there's not as much change needed to make the product, create the products, this activation energy is smaller, the reaction goes faster. So less activation energy, the faster the reaction can go. Okay? Because obviously it'll be easier for it to achieve that, essentially. But what are other things that can come into play? So again, think about collisions and think about energy needed. So first one would be concentration. If I increase concentration, it'll increase rate. Why? All right, as you can kind of see this picture of the 96 Olympics here, there's a lot of people. You're going to be collisions. There's going to be less space. They're going to more likely hit each other. So if those reactants are sitting on the left side of the chart and there's not a lot of them and they're not going to collide, we're not going to see it no matter how low that activation energy is. But if there's more particles, less space, more likely to hit each other. Number two is surface area. Okay, this is kind of related to orientation. But if there's more surface area occurring, it'll increase the rate. Why? There's more particles exposed. If you expose yourself more, it's going to be more likely to have a collision again occurring. Again, always go back to the idea of the collisions. There's more particles exposed. All right. So again, similar to what we talked about even with dissolving. All right. A lot of this stuff is also kind of related with dissolving rates. All right. If I have a sugar cube and I want it to react with acid, obviously only the outside of it's going to react with it, so that's going to take more time for it to get all the way through, versus if I smash it and pour the acid on top, everything will react. Okay? Temperature. Increased temperature increases rate. Again, you're increasing the kinetic energy. You're more likely to crash, but you're also already higher up on the activation energy chart. So factor 1, concentration. Factor 2, surface area. Factor 3, temperature. All All right, all of them increase the rate, all directly related. Factor 4, catalyst. Finally introducing a catalyst involved with these. The purpose of a catalyst is it's a substance that will help increase the rate of reaction without being consumed, so you can continue to get it back. What a catalyst actually does is actually one of two things. I have one written there. It will lower the activation energy of a reaction. That is definitely kind of like the more straightforward chemical definition of what a catalyst will do. And you can see again, according to my chart, we have the same reaction here. The blue and the red line is the same reaction from reactants to products. But when there's a catalyst, it goes across the red hump, which obviously means there needs less energy and it can move along. Now, one of the other reasons for that comes in is a catalyst also can open or reorient a molecule to prepare for a reaction. Okay? That is extremely common in biology because, again, if you get to more biochemistry with really understanding proteins and how they are developed and what they are, they're very, very, very twisted molecules. And so there's certain parts that are hidden maybe to the outside environment, but a catalyst can come along, hit a receptor, and essentially open that molecule up for a moment for it to then react possibly for different purposes. This is happening all the time inside our body with our cells. Okay, is that these catalysts involved are helping to reorganize what that structure looks like for a moment to lead to a outcome, a particular chemical reaction. Okay, catalysts are important because they do obviously perform reactions without increasing temperature. Inside our body, they are called enzymes. All right. And we actually also have the opposite. Everybody always doesn't think about it, but there is an opposite substance that can slow a reaction. That is called an inhibitor. Okay. Obviously, we use that with like food preservatives. Okay, something that will help protect it and will help slow the reaction process. Try to reorient the chemical back in a way where it's actually like protected from outside molecules. So enzymes here, again, this is what I was talking about. Enzymes are obviously catalysts. The idea is they can help reorient, again, in particular proteins. If they come together, if they come into it, like you can see with this little yellow one, and we have these two enzymes here, we have the two reactants involved. The problem is without this little yellow coenzyme, as it's called, the substrates cannot combine into the catalyst, and therefore you cannot have a chemical reaction. But if they do, we can create that product that's needed for it. So again, that's just something kind of neat to see that it can actually help reorient or reorganize it to make the chemical reaction more suitable. Okay. The last factor involved is pressure. It again only affects gases. We said that gases are only affected by pressures. All right. If I increase pressure, I can increase the reaction rate. Again, why? It forces those particles closer together. They will collide more. So those are all the factors basically being involved. All right. The big things again to understand is how each factor really does affect it. Explain the why behind it. Get into the idea of the activation energy. Be able to interpret those activation energy charts, and we are good to go. All right. That's it. Thank you.